Chapter 14. When Julia had rested, they followed the track before them, and in a short time arrived at a village, where they obtained security and refreshment. But Julia, whose mind was occupied with dreadful anxiety for Ferdinand, became indifferent to all around her. Even the presence of Ippolitus, which but lately would have raised her from misery to joy, failed to soothe her distress. The steady and noble attachment of her brother had sunk deep in her heart, and reflection only aggravated her affliction. Yet the banditti had steadily persisted in affirming that he was not concealed in their recesses, and this circumstance, which threw a deeper shade over the fears of Ippolitus, imparted a glimmering of hope to the mind of Julia. A more immediate interest at length forced her mind from this sorrowful subject. It was necessary to determine upon some line of conduct, for she was now in an unknown spot and ignorant of any place of refuge. The Count, who trembled at the dangers which environed her, and at the probabilities he saw of her being torn from him for ever, suffered a consideration of them to overcome the dangerous delicacy which, at this mournful period, required his silence. He entreated her to destroy the possibility of separation by consenting to become his immediately. He urged that a priest could be easily procured from a neighboring convent, who would confirm the bonds which had so long united their hearts, and who would thus at once arrest the destiny that so long had threatened his hopes. This proposal, though similar to the one she had before accepted, and though the certain means of rescuing her from the fate she dreaded, she now turned from in sorrow and dejection. She loved Ippolitus with a steady and tender affection, which was still heightened by the gratitude he claimed as her deliverer, but she considered it a profanation of the memory of that brother who had suffered so much for her sake, to mingle joy with the grief which her uncertainty concerning him occasioned. She softened her refusal with a tender grace, that quickly dissipated the jealous doubt arising in the mind of Ippolitus, and increased his fond admiration of her character. She desired to retire for a time to some obscure convent, there to await the issue of the event which at present involved her in perplexity and sorrow. Ippolitus struggled with his feelings, and forbore to press further the suit on which his happiness, and almost his existence, now depended. He inquired at the village for a neighboring convent, and was told that there was none within 12 leagues, but that near the town of Palini, about at that distance, were 2. He procured horses, and leaving the officers to return to Palermo for a stronger guard, he, accompanied by Julia, entered on the road to Palini. Julia was silent and thoughtful. Ippolitus gradually sunk into the same mood, and he often cast a cautious look around as they traveled for some hours along the feet of the mountains. They stopped to dine under the shade of some beech trees, for, fearful of discovery, Ippolitus had provided against the necessity of entering many inns. Having finished their repast, they pursued their journey, but Ippolitus now began to doubt whether he was in the right direction. Being destitute, however, of the means of certainty upon this point, he followed the road before him, which now wound up the side of a steep hill, whence they descended into a rich valley, where the shepherd's pipe sounded sweetly from afar among the hills. The evening sun shed a mild and mellow luster over the landscape, and softened each feature with a vermeil glow that would have inspired a mind less occupied than Julia's with sensations of congenial tranquillity. The evening now closed in, and as they were doubtful of the road, and found it would be impossible to reach Palini that night, they took the way to a village which they perceived at the extremity of the valley. They had proceeded about half a mile when they heard a sudden shout of voices echoed from among the hills behind them, and looking back perceived faintly through the dusk a party of men on horseback making towards them. As they drew nearer, the words they spoke were distinguishable, and Julia heard her own name sounded. Shocked at this circumstance, she had now no doubt that she was discovered by a party of her father's people, and she fled with Ippolitus along the valley. The pursuers, however, were almost come up with them when they reached the mouth of a cavern, into which she ran for concealment. Ippolitus drew his sword, and awaiting his enemies, stood to defend the entrance. In a few moments, Julia heard the clashing of swords. Her heart trembled for Ippolitus, and she was upon the point of returning to resign herself at once to the power of her enemies, and thus avert the danger that threatened him, when she distinguished the loud voice of the Duke. She shrunk involuntarily at the sound, and pursuing the windings of the cavern, fled into its inmost recesses. Here she had not been long when the voices sounded through the cave and drew near. It was now evident that Ippolitus was conquered, and that her enemies were in search of her. She threw round a look of unutterable anguish, and perceived very near, by a sudden gleam of torchlight, a low and deep recess in the rock. The light, which belonged to her pursuers, grew stronger, and she entered the rock on her knees, for the overhanging crags would not suffer her to pass otherwise, and, having gone a few yards, perceived that it was terminated by a door. The door yielded to her touch, and she suddenly found herself in a highly vaulted cavern, which received a feeble light from the moonbeams that streamed through an opening in the rock above. She closed the door and paused to listen. The voices grew louder and more distinct, and at last approached so near that she distinguished what was said. Above the rest she heard the voice of the Duke. "It is impossible she can have quitted the cavern," said he, "and I will not leave it till I have found her. Seek to the left of that rock, while I examine beyond this point." These words were sufficient for Julia. She fled from the door across the cavern before her, and, having run a considerable way, without coming to a termination, stopped to breathe. All was now still, and as she looked around, the gloomy obscurity of the place struck upon her fancy all its horrors. She imperfectly surveyed the vastness of the cavern in wild amazement, and feared that she had precipitated herself again into the power of banditti, for whom alone this place appeared a fit receptacle. Having listened a long time without hearing a return of voices, she thought to find the door by which she had entered, but the gloom and vast extent of the cavern made the endeavor hopeless and the attempt unsuccessful. Having wandered a considerable time through the void, she gave up the effort, endeavored to resign herself to her fate, and to compose her distracted thoughts. The remembrance of her former wonderful escape inspired her with confidence in the mercy of God. But Ippolitus and Ferdinand were now both lost to her, lost perhaps forever, and the uncertainty of their fate gave force to fancy and poignancy to sorrow. Towards morning, grief yielded to nature, and Julia sunk to repose. She was awakened by the sun, whose rays, darting obliquely through the opening in the rock, threw a partial light across the cavern. Her senses were yet bewildered by sleep, and she started in affright on beholding her situation. As recollection gradually stole upon her mind, her sorrows returned, and she sickened at the fatal retrospect. She arose and renewed her search for an outlet. The light, imperfect as it was, now assisted her, and she found a door, which she perceived was not the one by which she had entered. It was firmly fastened. She discovered, however, the bolts and the lock that held it, and at length unclosed the door. It opened upon a dark passage, which she entered. She groped along the winding walls for some time, when she perceived the way was obstructed. She now discovered that another door interrupted her progress, and sought for the bolts which might fasten it. These she found, and, strengthened by desperation, forced them back. The door opened, and she beheld in a small room, which received its feeble light from a window above, the pale and emaciated figure of a woman, seated with half-closed eyes in a kind of elbow-chair. On perceiving Julia, she started from her seat, and her countenance expressed a wild surprise. Her features, which were worn by sorrow, still retained the traces of beauty, and in her air was a mild dignity that excited in Julia an involuntary veneration. She seemed as if about to speak, when fixing her eyes earnestly and steadily upon Julia, she stood for a moment in eager gaze, and suddenly exclaiming, "My daughter!" fainted away. The astonishment of Julia would scarcely suffer her to assist the lady, who lay senseless on the floor. A multitude of strange, imperfect ideas rushed upon her mind, and she was lost in perplexity. But as she examined the features of the stranger, which were now rekindling into life, she thought she discovered the resemblance of Amelia. The lady, breathing a deep sigh, unclosed her eyes. She raised them to Julia, who hung over her in speechless astonishment, and fixing them upon her with a tender, earnest expression, they filled with tears. She pressed Julia to her heart, and a few moments of exquisite, unutterable emotion followed. When the lady became more composed, "Thank heaven," said she, "my prayer is granted. I am permitted to embrace one of my children before I die. Tell me what brought you hither. Has the Marquis at last relented, and allowed me once more to behold you? Or has his death dissolved my wretched bondage?" Truth now glimmered upon the mind of Julia, but so faintly that instead of enlightening, it served only to increase her perplexity. "Is the Marquis Mazzini living?" continued the lady. These words were not to be doubted. Julia threw herself at the feet of her mother, and embracing her knees in an energy of joy, answered only in sobs. The Marchioness eagerly inquired after her children. "Amelia is living," answered Julia, "but my dear brother—" "Tell me!" cried the Marchioness with quickness. An explanation ensued. When she was informed concerning Ferdinand, she sighed deeply, and, raising her eyes to heaven, endeavored to assume a look of pious resignation. But the struggle of maternal feelings was visible in her countenance, and almost overcame her powers of resistance. Julia gave a short account of the preceding adventures, and of her entrance into the cavern, and found, to her inexpressible surprise, that she was now in a subterranean abode belonging to the southern buildings of the castle of Mazzini. The Marchioness was beginning her narrative when a door was heard to unlock above, and the sound of a footstep followed. "Fly!" cried the Marchioness. "Secret yourself, if possible, for the Marquis is coming." Julia's heart sunk at these words. She paused not a moment, but retired through the door by which she had entered. This she had scarcely done when another door of the cell was unlocked, and she heard the voice of her father. Its sounds thrilled her with universal tremor. The dread of discovery so strongly operated upon her mind that she stood in momentary expectation of seeing the door of that passage unclosed by the Marquis, and she was deprived of all power of seeking refuge in the cavern. At length the Marquis, who came with food, quitted the cell, and relocked the door when Julia stole forth from her hiding-place. The Marchioness again embraced and wept over her daughter. The narrative of her sufferings, upon which she now entered, entirely dissipated the mystery which had so long enveloped the southern buildings of the castle. "Oh, why," said the Marchioness, "is it my task to discover to my daughter the vices of her father? In relating my sufferings, I reveal his crimes. It is now about 15 years, as near as I can guess, from the small means I have of judging, since I entered this horrible abode. My sorrows, alas, began not here. They commenced at an earlier period, but it is sufficient to observe that the passion whence originated all my misfortunes was discovered by me long before I experienced its most baleful effects. 7 years had elapsed since my marriage when the charms of Maria del Vellorno, a young lady singularly beautiful, inspired the Marquis with a passion as violent as it was irregular. I observed with deep and silent anguish the cruel indifference of my lord towards me, and the rapid progress of his passion for another. I severely examined my past conduct, which I am thankful to say presented a retrospect of only blameless actions, and I endeavored by meek submission and tender assiduities to recall that affection which was, alas, gone for ever. My meek submission was considered as a mark of a servile and insensible mind, and my tender assiduities, to which his heart no longer responded, created only disgust, and exalted the proud spirit it was meant to conciliate. The secret grief which this change occasioned consumed my spirits and preyed upon my constitution, till at length a severe illness threatened my life. I beheld the approach of death with a steady eye, and even welcomed it as the passport to tranquillity, but it was destined that I should linger through new scenes of misery. One day, which it appears was the paroxysm of my disorder, I sunk into a state of total torpidity, in which I lay for several hours. It is impossible to describe my feelings when, on recovering, I found myself in this hideous abode. For some time I doubted my senses, and afterwards believed that I had quitted this world for another. But I was not long suffered to continue in my error, the appearance of the Marquis bringing me to a perfect sense of my situation. I now understood that I had been conveyed by his direction to this recess of horror, where it was his will I should remain. My prayers, my supplications were ineffectual. The hardness of his heart repelled my sorrows back upon myself, and as no entreaties could prevail upon him to inform me where I was, or of his reason for placing me here, I remained for many years ignorant of my vicinity to the castle, and of the motive of my confinement. From that fatal day, until very lately, I saw the Marquis no more, but was attended by a person who had been for some years dependent upon his bounty, and whom necessity, united to an insensible heart, had doubtless induced to accept this office. He generally brought me a week's provisions at stated intervals, and I remarked that his visits were always in the night. Contrary to my expectation or my wish, nature did that for me which medicine had refused, and I recovered, as if to punish with disappointment and anxiety my cruel tyrant. I afterwards learned that in obedience to the Marquis's order I had been carried to this spot by Vincent during the night, and that I had been buried in effigy at a neighboring church, with all the pomp of funeral honor due to my rank. At the name of Vincent, Julia started. The doubtful words he had uttered on his deathbed were now explained. The cloud of mystery which had so long involved the southern buildings broke at once away, and each particular circumstance that had excited her former terror arose to her view entirely unveiled by the words of the Marchioness. The long and total desertion of this part of the fabric, the light that had appeared through the casement, the figure she had seen issue from the tower, the midnight noises she had heard, were circumstances evidently dependent on the imprisonment of the Marchioness, the latter of which incidents were produced either by Vincent or the Marquis in their attendance upon her. When she considered the long and dreadful sufferings of her mother, and that she had for many years lived so near her, ignorant of her misery, and even of her existence, she was lost in astonishment and pity. My days, continued the Marchioness, passed in a dead uniformity, more dreadful than the most acute vicissitudes of misfortune, and which would certainly have subdued my reason, had not those firm principles of religious faith, which I imbibed in early youth, enabled me to withstand the still but forceful pressure of my calamity. The insensible heart of Vincent at length began to soften to my misfortunes. He brought me several articles of comfort, of which I had hitherto been destitute, and answered some questions I put to him concerning my family. To release me from my present situation, however his inclination might befriend me, was not to be expected, since his life would have paid the forfeiture of what would be termed his duty. I now first discovered my vicinity to the castle. I learned also that the Marquis had married Maria del Vellorno, with whom he had resided at Naples, but that my daughters were left at Mazzini. This last intelligence awakened in my heart the throbs of warm maternal tenderness, and on my knees I supplicated to see them. So earnestly I entreated, and so solemnly I promised to return quietly to my prison, that at length prudence yielded to pity, and Vincent consented to my request. On the following day he came to the cell, and informed me that my children were going into the woods, and that I might see them from a window near which they would pass. My nerves thrilled at these words, and I could scarcely support myself to the spot I so eagerly sought. He led me through long and intricate passages, as I guessed by the frequent turnings, for my eyes were bound, till I reached a hall of the south buildings. I followed to a room above, where the full light of day once more burst upon my sight, and almost overpowered me. Vincent placed me by a window which looked towards the woods. Oh, what moments of painful impatience were those in which I awaited your arrival! At length you appeared. I saw you. I saw my children, and I was neither permitted to clasp them to my heart nor to speak to them. You were leaning on the arm of your sister, and your countenance spoke the sprightly, happy innocence of youth. Alas, you knew not the wretched fate of your mother, who then gazed upon you. Although you were at too great a distance for my weak voice to reach you, with the utmost difficulty I avoided throwing open the window and endeavoring to discover myself. The remembrance of my solemn promise, and that the life of Vincent would be sacrificed by the act, alone restrained me. I struggled for some time with emotions too powerful for my nature, and fainted away. On recovering, I called wildly for my children, and went to the window, but you were gone. Not all the entreaties of Vincent could for some time remove me from this station, where I waited in the fond expectation of seeing you again, but you appeared no more. At last I returned to my cell in an ecstasy of grief which I tremble even to remember. This interview, so eagerly sought and so reluctantly granted, proved a source of new misery. Instead of calming, it agitated my mind with a restless wild despair, which bore away my strongest powers of resistance. I raved incessantly of my children, and incessantly solicited to see them again. Vincent, however, had found but too much cause to repent of his first indulgence to grant me a second. About this time a circumstance occurred which promised me a speedy release from calamity. About a week elapsed, and Vincent did not appear. My little stock of provision was exhausted, and I had been 2 days without food, when I again heard the doors that led to my prison creak on their hinges. An unknown step approached, and in a few minutes the Marquis entered my cell. My blood was chilled at the sight, and I closed my eyes, as I hoped for the last time. The sound of his voice recalled me. His countenance was dark and sullen, and I perceived that he trembled. He informed me that Vincent was no more, and that henceforward his office he should take upon himself. I forbore to reproach, where reproach would only have produced new sufferings, and withheld supplication, where it would have exasperated conscience and inflamed revenge. My knowledge of the Marquis's second marriage I concealed. He usually attended me when night might best conceal his visits, though these were irregular in their return. Lately, from what motive I cannot guess, he has ceased his nocturnal visits, and comes only in the day. Once, when midnight increased the darkness of my prison, and seemed to render silence even more awful, touched by the sacred horrors of the hour, I poured forth my distress in loud lamentation. Oh, never can I forget what I felt when I heard a distant voice answer to my moan. A wild surprise, which was strangely mingled with hope, seized me, and in my first emotion I should have answered the call, had not a recollection crossed me which destroyed at once every half-raised sensation of joy. I remembered the dreadful vengeance which the Marquis had sworn to execute upon me if I ever, by any means, endeavoured to make known the place of my concealment, and though life had long been a burden to me, I dared not to incur the certainty of being murdered. I also well knew that no person who might discover my situation could effect my enlargement, for I had no relations to deliver me by force, and the Marquis, you know, has not only power to imprison, but also the right of life and death in his own domains. I, therefore, forbore to answer the call, though I could not entirely repress my lamentation. I long perplexed myself with endeavouring to account for this strange circumstance, and am to this moment ignorant of its cause. Julia, remembering that Ferdinand had been confined in a dungeon of the castle, it instantly occurred to her that his prison and that of the Marchioness were not far distant, and she scrupled not to believe that it was his voice which her mother had heard. She was right in this belief, and it was indeed the Marchioness whose groans had formerly caused Ferdinand so much alarm, both in the marble hall of the South Buildings and in his dungeon. When Julia communicated her opinion, and the Marchioness believed that she had heard the voice of her son, her emotion was extreme, and it was some time before she could resume her narration. "A short time since," continued the Marchioness, "the Marquis brought me a fortnight's provision, and told me that I should probably see him no more till the expiration of that term. His absence at this period you have explained in your account of the transactions at the Abbey of St. Augustine. How can I ever sufficiently acknowledge the obligations I owe to my dear and invaluable friend, Madame de Menin? Oh, that it might be permitted me to testify my gratitude." Julia attended to the narrative of her mother in silent astonishment, and gave all the sympathy which sorrow could demand. "Surely," cried she, "the Providence on whom you have so firmly relied, and whose inflictions you have supported with a fortitude so noble, has conducted me through a labyrinth of misfortunes to this spot for the purpose of delivering you. Oh, let us hasten to fly this horrid abode. Let us seek to escape through the cavern by which I entered." She paused in earnest expectation, awaiting a reply. "Whither can I fly?" said the Marchioness, deeply sighing. This question, spoken with the emphasis of despair, affected Julia to tears, and she was for a while silent. "The Marquis," resumed Julia, "would not know where to seek you, or if he found you beyond his domains, would fear to claim you. A convent may afford for the present a safe asylum, and whatever shall happen, surely no fate you may hereafter encounter can be more dreadful than the one you now experience." The Marchioness assented to the truth of this, yet her broken spirits, the effect of long sorrow and confinement, made her hesitate how to act, and there was a kind of placid despair in her look which too faithfully depicted her feelings. It was obvious to Julia that the cavern she had passed wound beneath the range of mountains on whose opposite side stood the castle of Mazzini. The hills thus rising formed a screen which must entirely conceal their emergence from the mouth of the cave, and their flight from those in the castle. She represented these circumstances to her mother, and urged them so forcibly that the lethargy of despair yielded to hope, and the Marchioness committed herself to the conduct of her daughter. "Oh, let me lead you to light and life," cried Julia with warm enthusiasm. "Surely heaven can bless me with no greater good than by making me the deliverer of my mother." They both knelt down, and the Marchioness, with that affecting eloquence which true piety inspires, and with that confidence which had supported her through so many miseries, committed herself to the protection of God, and implored his favour on their attempt. They arose, but as they conversed further on their plan, Julia recollected that she was destitute of money, the banditti having robbed her of all. The sudden shock produced by this remembrance almost subdued her spirits. Never till this moment had she understood the value of money. But she commanded her feelings, and resolved to conceal this circumstance from the Marchioness, preferring the chance of any evil they might encounter from without to the certain misery of this terrible imprisonment. Having taken what provision the Marquis had brought, they quitted the cell and entered upon the dark passage, along which they passed with cautious steps. Julia came first to the door of the cavern, but who can paint her distress when she found it was fastened? All her efforts to open it were ineffectual. The door, which had closed after her, was held by a spring lock, and could be opened on this side only with a key. When she understood this circumstance, the Marchioness, with a placid resignation which seemed to exalt her above humanity, addressed herself again to heaven, and turned back to her cell. Here Julia indulged without reserve, and without scruple, the excess of her grief. The Marchioness wept over her. "Not for myself," said she, "do I grieve. I have too long been inured to misfortune to sink under its pressure. This disappointment is intrinsically perhaps little, for I had no certain refuge from calamity, and had it even been otherwise, a few years only of suffering would have been spared me. It is for you, Julia, who so much lament my fate, and who, in being thus delivered to the power of your father, are sacrificed to the Duke de Luovo, that my heart swells." Julia could make no reply, but by pressing to her lips the hand which was held forth to her. She saw all the wretchedness of her situation, and her fearful uncertainty concerning Hippolytus and Ferdinand formed no inferior part of her affliction. "If," resumed the Marchioness, "you prefer imprisonment with your mother to a marriage with the Duke, you may still secret yourself in the passage we have just quitted, and partake of the provision which is brought me." "Oh, talk not, madame, of a marriage with the Duke," said Julia. "Surely any fate is preferable to that. But when I consider that in remaining here I am condemned only to the sufferings which my mother has so long endured, and that this confinement will enable me to soften by tender sympathy the asperity of her misfortunes, I ought to submit to my present situation with complacency, even did a marriage with the Duke appear less hateful to me." "Excellent girl!" exclaimed the Marchioness, clasping Julia to her bosom. "The sufferings you lament are almost repaid by this proof of your goodness and affection. Alas, that I should have been so long deprived of such a daughter." Julia now endeavoured to imitate the fortitude of her mother, and tenderly concealed her anxiety for Ferdinand and Hippolytus, the idea of whom incessantly haunted her imagination. When the Marquis brought food to the cell, she retired to the avenue leading to the cavern, and escaped discovery.